we're going to be in Luke chapter 5, and so if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn over to that. That chapter, Luke 5, the beginning of a new series this morning called Just Fishing. Just Fishing. And we're going to be talking about this call that God's placed on our life to reach the people around us for Jesus. And it all comes around this idea that we talk about a lot around here. That our mission as a church is to invite our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus. That Jesus is the center of the call that he's placed in our lives, and that we want people to know him. We want people to have an interaction with him and meet him for the first time if they've never met Jesus, they've never interacted with him. And then we would also invite them to follow Jesus. And that really is to invite them to do the thing that we're trying to do, right? As we meet Jesus, we have an interaction with Jesus. We turn into, when we confess him as Lord and when we trust on him for salvation, we become followers. That's one of the words, one of the pieces of language that the Bible attaches to what this Christian life is supposed to be, that we're followers of Jesus. And so that's the way we talk about it around here. This morning, we're going to specifically talk about how every follower of Jesus, so, if you've made the choice to follow Jesus, if you've confessed him as Lord and are a Christian, then we're followers of Jesus. Every follower of Jesus has a new life assignment. So this is an emphasis here is on the every, right? That we're all called into this new life assignment. We're going to talk about what that is through this story of God calling one man in particular, a guy we might be familiar with, Peter. And so as you guys turn in your Bibles there, I just wanted to give that little bit of an introduction to where we're headed over the next few weeks. And wanted to, before I jump in, invite you guys. We're after the service in the Student Center, we're having our first ever Serve Basics class. And so that's going to start at about 11:30 with some lunch. So if you head over, I know you guys always want to talk and stuff, which is fine, whatever. You guys can talk. But at some point, if you want to go join us for Serve Basics, you got to make your way, move the conversation over to the other building, grab a plate, and then we're going to have a conversation for an hour or two about what it looks like to be a part of the local church, what it means to serve, some equipping that way. And so this is the thing. Serve Basics, I've been thinking about it this way. This is sort of like an all-hands-on-deck thing. And we know it's not everybody can make today, and that's fine. So we're going to run this every couple of months for the next few years. But we really would like everybody who's a part of the church, whether you are serving already on a team or you just kind of are new to the church and you don't even know what that really looks like. If you're in either of those camps, Serve Basics is for you. Okay, so at some point, we'd love everybody to go through it. We think that the content in there is really important for us as a church family to get to know how to serve one another, how to love one another the way Christ would love us. And so anyway, that's my pitch. So I know a bunch of you registered. If you thought about registering and you didn't register, no worries. We will have space for you. The Lord always provides the right amount of food for the right amount of people around here. It's one of the things he does. Something about fish and loaves, right? So anyway, we invite you to join us after church for that part of things. Okay, so has anybody ever had a bad day? All right. We're going to talk about a bad day that Peter had. Some of us have had a bad day. Some of us have had a bad month. Last month was the longest year of my life. I don't know if you've ever had one of those months, right? Where it's just like things just keep going wrong. And you're like, really? Another thing, right? And so I'm real happy it's September. I'm hoping that just like kicks something into a new gear. But it's funny. We're going to talk here in a second about this, how Jesus shows up and turns Peter's bad day, and it's probably not like the worst day of his life. He was just having a regular old bad day. You know what I mean? One of those. When you're just like you're at work and you're just trying to get home, right? So that you can start again tomorrow. Can we just start over, right? He's having one of those days. And Jesus decides that on one of those days is a good day to show up and call him to be his disciple. And so I don't know. It's a fast for me who have had a series of bad days the last few weeks. I just kind of it felt personal to me. So maybe it'll feel personal to you, and we'll see what happens. So Luke chapter 5 is where the story we're going to look at this morning, and this is really helps us to kick off this idea of just fishing and where the whole idea comes from. What do you mean just fishing? Well, it's an illustration that Jesus gives to a guy who was a fisherman, right? And so just like when Jesus shows, when God talks to David and talks about him as a shepherd, there's significance to that. He's showing up into the person's life, and he's using language that they can understand in a very specific way. Maybe we might struggle to understand it, but they're going to understand it. And so we're going to talk about that. What was Peter's deal? So I look at this sermon or this passage in sort of three sections. First, Jesus interrupts Peter's life. And Jesus, by the way, he interrupts our lives, doesn't he? Like all of us, we're just living our lives, and then one day somebody came along and invited us to church, or somebody told us something and encouraged us in a way, and we said, well, what are you even talking about? And then through a process, they introduced us to Jesus. Or we were just that kid, right, who was a homeschool kid who showed up and got in the church van. It was actually it looked like a church van, but it was the van that my parents drove because there were 10 kids. But anyway, you get in the van and you go to church just because you've always done that. But then that one day, Jesus shows up, and interrupts your normally scheduled thing. So Jesus interrupts our life. Jesus reveals himself to us. Jesus reveals himself to Peter, we're going to see in the story. And then the last thing is that Jesus gives us a new job. So those are the three things that happen in the story. He interrupts us. He interrupts Peter. He interrupts us. He reveals himself to us. He reveals himself to Peter in the story. And then he gives Peter a new job, and I think he gives us really, truly, all a new job. So those are going to be the three sections as we jump in. So chapter 5, Luke chapter 5, verse 1. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. They're also going to be up here on the screen. It goes like this. It says, on one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake Gennesaret. I'm going to help you out here. The he is Jesus. Doesn't actually say Jesus there, but is referred to from earlier, right? So Jesus, it says, on one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear the word of God, Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. So just so you know, there's like a bunch of different names for the same place in the Bible. It's real fun. It's like this weird puzzle game you got to play when you're first learning to read the Bible. But the lake Gennesaret is the same as the Sea of Galilee, right? Same place. Or Tiberias, right? There's like 8 names for it. You got to love it. And so verse 2, he saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets. All right. So section 1, right? Jesus interrupts our life. How does Jesus interrupt Peter's life? Well, I love Dr. Luke. Luke, the author of this gospel account, was a medical doctor. He's a really smart guy, right? And he also, being one of the early disciples, he was like a astute student of the Old Testament. So he learned from reading the Old Testament how to tell a story. And so he very similar to the way the Old Testament tells a story, does this in a really kind of powerful and poetic and just beautiful way. Because it starts with just one day, Jesus was on the side of the lake, and he was teaching. And then there was boats, right? And it doesn't say anything about, he doesn't start out and say, hey, I'm going to tell you the story about how Peter became the Apostle Peter. He just starts talking about, one day, just a regular Tuesday or whatever day of the week it was, right? Jesus was out teaching. And a whole crowd of people had gathered. And we can kind of imagine that scene. By the way, Jesus wasn't the only rabbi who attracted a crowd. People would have traveled to this actual kind of area. It was kind of well known to be a spot where rabbis would go and kind of hang out. And so people would come in the off season of their agricultural jobs, and they would come and they'd camp out, and they'd just come listen to whatever Bible conference speaker was hanging out that week. And Jesus happened to be one of those rabbis, one of those Bible conference speakers. But Jesus had a crowd control problem, right? He had too many people interested in hearing his talks. And, that makes sense, what with him being God and all. He was a really good speaker, and there was something about him where people were like, I want to hear what this guy has to say. And so he's standing next to the Sea of Galilee, and everybody just keeps getting closer, and he's like, I got two options. I could stand in this water, or I could ask this dude to borrow his boat. And actually, this was something that was pretty commonly done. So what we haven't talked about at all is Peter's perspective, right? I want you to think for a second about that. So Peter, and we only know this as we progressively read through the passage, right? We don't even know it's Peter until verse 3. And we don't really know about what Peter's night was like the night before, but it says that they had come in. He says it in verse 5, right? He says, so we know from verse 5 that Peter had went out fishing at night, and that they had what? What does it say? They had caught nothing. But that's not how he says it. He says it in a very specific way. He says, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Right? The emphasis is on, I am really tired of fishing right now. Like, I on the way back in, Jesus, I thought about selling this boat. Like, they say the two happiest days of boat ownership are the day you buy the boat and the day you sell the boat. And Peter's like thinking about Facebook Marketplace in this thing. He's done. I've toiled all night and we caught nothing. All right, so when we backfill all that information into the previous section of the story, it's actually kind of funny. So Jesus is hanging out, preaching. Peter's paddling in, thinking about selling his boat. I'm done. This fishing thing really stinks, literally. But of course now I've got to deal with this big crowd of people. So not only, right, do I have to clean my nets, which is it's like salt in the wound because I didn't catch anything, but I still got to clean these stupid nets. But I got to deal with these people, and now here comes this guy coming over. What does he want? Oh, he wants me to he wants to get in my boat and wants me to put out. Okay. And we got to understand, right? Peter lives in an honor-shame society, right? So he would have never thought anything, but I have to help this guy if he asks me. That's just how they operated, right? There would have been no, hey, get lost. I got better things to do. This is a rabbi come to talk to a guy, and so it was a sense of honor and a dignity to that. And so he obliges Jesus and says, "Sure, I'll take you out of my boat." But you got to think inside, what's Peter want to do? Peter just wants to go home, right? His wife's probably making dinner, right? There's probably like a bed waiting for him, but here's Jesus saying, "Hey, get in the boat. I want to go out in the boat." So then he does it, and who knows? I mean, Jesus was a preacher and a rabbi in a day and age before television, before TikTok. So people's like attention spans was way longer. And his like subject matter was the Old Testament, which people that day and age had like memorized whole sections of. So who knows how long Jesus went talking in Peter's boat, right? Could have been hours. And Peter's just sitting there, and And then, after all of that, Jesus looks at Peter and says, hey, let's go fishing. Peter had no idea, right, who was getting into his boat. But he kindly stopped what he was doing and paddled Jesus out so that the crowd could hear him. And Luke doesn't really say it in the storytelling version that he gives us here. But I think Peter listened to what Jesus said. He didn't really have an option. He was in the boat with them, right? And so he's listening to what Jesus is saying. And I take this idea from later where Jesus' words to Peter in response to that invitation to go fishing is, sure, right? He says, because this isn't how he says it. He says it in a very specific way. He says, Master, we already talked about this part, right? Master, we toiled all night and caught nothing. Very dramatic, right? But then he says, but at your word, right? He says, somebody else would have asked me, I'd have told him to take a hike. But I've been listening to you preach for the last hour and a half. And there's something unique about you. So at your word, Jesus, I'll do the thing that makes no sense. I'll do the thing that's the last thing on my list of things I'd like to do with the next hour of my life. I'll show up. I'll do the thing. I'll put out my nets. When Jesus interrupts our lives, and some of us were like, some of y'all I can tell by your looks, like you're offended by me saying that Jesus is an interruption, but I think it's true, especially when we first start out, right? We didn't plan on, just like Peter didn't plan on having this interaction with Jesus, we didn't plan on these interactions, these moments where Jesus shows up into our lives. And at first, they're not welcome interruptions, right? Why? But why was Peter so quick to leave his nets and follow Jesus? Because that's what happens at the end of the story, not to like ruin the end of the story for you. But by the end of this, Peter sells the boat and joins Jesus' ministry. Why was he so quick to do it? I think he was tired. He saw a glimpse of a different kind of life. And this is often where God leads us, right? He waits for us he waits to show up on the scene of our lives until we have exhausted all of our own resources, all of our own ideas. We're just done. And then he shows up and says, here I am. He waits till we're ready to go all in with him. Peter had a interaction with Jesus that was pretty one-sided, right? He had to listen to Jesus preach. But Peter knew a thing or two about the power of the words of Jesus, and this was became a theme in his life, because later in John 6, there's this whole scene where Jesus has this interaction with his disciples after he went out preaching and ticked a bunch of people off. I don't know if you know that. But sometimes Jesus went out preaching and it didn't go well. And actually, the crowd went from 1,000 people. He doesn't say what the numbers were, but like it went from 1,000 people to 500 people. And everybody's looking at Jesus like, oh, Jesus, you really messed up. You lost out all those people. And he looks at his disciples and he says, do you want to go away as well? And it's funny. Peter says to him, Lord, to whom shall we go? He said, you have the words of eternal life. And we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Imagine what would have happened if Peter would have said, no way, Jesus. I'm not letting out my nets. I just cleaned those nets. I'm done. I'm going home. Jesus was already preparing Peter for a life of following him and the kinds of like typical Jesus interruptions that come with that. And the faith that it takes to look at a situation and say, hey, I just want to go home, but Jesus said I'm supposed to do this. So I'm going to do it out of obedience. And it's that seed of faith, right? We talk about mustard seeds. It's that seed of faith that is planted here. And Jesus is going to do something with that as we continue the story. Look at verse 6. So that's the interruption section. Now is the revealing section. Because to this point, Peter doesn't really know who he's talking to, right? He's about to find out. So Jesus reveals himself to us, verse 6 through 10. When they had done this, it says they enclosed a large number of fish. It doesn't give us any of the details, so if you're a fisherman, you're disappointed. You're like, what lure did they use, right? What was the strategy? None of that. It was just they went out, put out the nets, and there was a bunch of them. It says they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats, so that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with them were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Okay, so one of the things I love the most about this section is just how personal this miracle is to Peter. Because Peter is a fisherman. He thought of, his life was all about fish, right? If you guys have work dreams, right? Like you go home after a long day and you're thinking about work, and so some wild thing happens, right? If you're a teacher, like that student is the problem student, and they turn into this like rage monster in your dream. You know, it's like I remember working at a coffee shop when I was a student, and I would just have coffee dreams, and that's a weird thing to have, right? And so this is Peter's life, right? He's just fish. Fish is his thing. And his currency was fish. When he closed his eyes at night, he dreamt of fish. He smelled like a fish, probably. And for him and for these other two future disciples in the story, Jesus shows up and puts his power and abundance on display in the form of fish. In the thing that was their world, in the thing that made sense to them, in the thing that was personal to them. And so Jesus had already interrupted Peter, and now he shows himself to Peter in this unique way that really only he could fully comprehend. You know, we read this story and we're like, okay, there was a lot of fish. Sounds great. But only Peter really knew how miraculous that catch was. Only a fisherman would know that, right? This doesn't just happen. We would go out, and it doesn't say this, but we'd go out for a week and not catch that many fish, Jesus. And we brought that all in one haul. And he understood something supernatural had happened. This wasn't a happenstance thing. It was obvious to Peter. But it was unique to Peter also. And I think that day, that catch of fish, probably lived in Peter's memory and in his imagination for the rest of his life, if you think about it, right? Because he followed Jesus around for the next 3 years, and then he denies him 3 times, and then he's forgiven 3 times, and then he winds up preaching the sermon in Acts chapter 2 that starts the church, and he begins this ministry in Jerusalem, and he's this anchor, this rock that Jesus said he would build the church on, and ultimately he dies a martyr's death, and he's believed to have been hung on a cross upside down because the Romans didn't want to give him the benefit of having the same crucifixion that Jesus had. And so this is Peter's whole life is changed in this moment with these fish. And I have to think he thought about it on a pretty regular basis. The day that he was martyred, he probably remembered that sight of the abundance of the fish, the feeling of the boats as they were weighed down and almost sinking, right? the feeling of awe looking at this man, Jesus, whose words were true and whose power could even fill boats with fish. And once again, Peter's reaction stands out for me, at least in Luke's account, because he zooms in on Peter. Everything's happening. There's fish jumping around in the boat. You can only imagine if you've had like one fish in a boat, you know how chaotic that is. Imagine just a boat full of fish flopping around. And Peter looks at Jesus, and what does he say? Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. The words of the apostle mirror the words of Isaiah. When Isaiah sees that vision, I don't know if you remember that story, Isaiah in chapter 6 sees a vision of the throne room of God. And he doesn't say, hey, cool, let me get my journal out and write it down. What does he say? He says, woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. This is a common reaction when people see Jesus, right? When people understand that they're standing before the holy God, they say, they become hyper aware of their sin. They become hyper aware of that they're unworthy to be in his presence. It's interesting. A couple months ago, we studied a passage that talks about how Jesus is a refiner and a refiner's fire. And so when we're in his presence, he draws the sin out of our lives like a refiner, like a fire and a refiner would draw out impurities in metal, right? Or in gold. And so this sense of dread and fear is common in Scripture. But you know what else is common in Scripture? Jesus' reaction. Jesus' response. He says, Jesus, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. You don't know what I've done. You don't know how messed up I am. And Jesus looks at him and says, don't be afraid. And then gives him an invitation to follow him. Was the problem that Jesus didn't know that Peter was a sinner? No. Jesus knew 100% who he was talking to. He knew all the things that, not just all the things that Peter had done, but all the things that Peter was going to do. He knew that Peter, 3 years later, was going to betray him 3 times the night that he was arrested. And he still happened to show up that day, right? And happened to get in Pete's boat. And it's this beautiful pattern, right, of how Jesus interrupts our life and then reveals himself to us. And it gives us a choice, right? It says, are you gonna follow me? So Peter didn't have to do it. It was a choice he laid out for Peter. He doesn't let him off the hook. He says, oh, you're right, Pete. You're a screw up. I can't have you on my team. Now that you said that, Peter, now that I know that you're a sinner, you're disqualified. No, he says, don't be afraid. I already know all of your stuff. And I still came to call you to follow me. What's fascinating is something that I skipped past, like the first 8 times I read this. Super cool. Look at verse 5 again, okay? So when Jesus starts, after Jesus preaches, and he tells Peter, hey, we're going to get in the boat and let out the nets, or he asks him to. What does Peter say? He says, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets. That word master, he calls him master. Master was a term of reverence and of respect. It's like, I don't know, like mister, right? Like sir. And so he says, he uses this term of reverence and this term of respect because he's talking to a rabbi. And so he calls him master. But what does he call him in verse 8? He says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Oh, well, that's different. right? And those of us who've read our Bibles for a while, we know that term only gets used for God. So before Peter goes out and catches all these fish, Jesus is just, he's a rabbi. I respect him. I'll pay him that level of homage. But here he gets on his knees, which is, for a Jewish boy who is taught since he was yay high, right? There's one God, Deuteronomy 6:4. He says, but he gets down on his knees. This is dangerous territory. And then he says, and then he calls him Lord. And so what's happened here, right? Jesus has shifted in Peter's mind from this rabbi guy I respect to, it doesn't make sense to me, and I know I'll probably get in trouble, but this is God in human flesh. This is the Messiah. This is the Lord standing before me. It was the only explanation that he had for what he saw. And so getting on his knees and calling him Lord, he's setting this example for us, right? That the scriptures are super clear that when we have an interaction with Jesus, the response is to bow ourselves. What doesn't have to be physically, right? But in this case, he did. He gets on his knees and he calls him Lord. What else does he do? He confesses his sin, right? He says, I am a sinner. And so this is where we get this idea that when we become followers of Jesus, it begins with this prostrate bowing and with this confession and with saying, you're the one in charge, not me. So that's ultimately what Lord means. So certainly few of us have had such a miraculous and powerful conversion as Peter. Jesus probably didn't come in the flesh and pull off a miracle to get you to kneel. But here's the thing that he does continue to do. He shows up and reveals himself in power in our lives in ways that we can connect with. And so he reveals himself to us. The last thing he does is he gives us a new job. Luke 5:10, the second half of it. I'm going to actually start from verse 8. So we can see the whole thing as it closes out. Verse 8 says, when Peter saw, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken, and so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. It's interesting. I think it's in the book of Mark. It tells us the same story, and it uses that terminology that we're familiar with from Sunday school. Says you'll be a fishers of men, right? But here he says you'll be catching men. Jesus gives him a new job, and what's fascinating is what we're talking about as we kick off this series and talking about this call that we all have to invite our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus. We're saying Peter's not alone. Like this passage, the story of how he was called is a pattern that we all have in our lives, that he interrupts, that he reveals himself, and that he gives us a new job. He gives us a new life assignment. And so for Peter, he puts it in terms that he can understand. He says, you're going to be catching men. You've been catching fish. Today you caught a bunch. And not for nothing, you caught him because I'm here. So how about we go into business together, except we're going to do it a little different. We're not catching fish anymore. We're going to be catching men. But, I think there is a lot of meaning in that idea, right? There's a lot of concepts for Peter because he knows what it means to be a fisher of fish. right? You know what it means to be a teacher at your school. You know what it means to be a student at your school. You know what it means to be an employee at your place of work. And just how fascinating is it that Peter shows up and talks to a guy who's a fisherman and uses that world in the same way he does with shepherds, in the same way he does with fathers, all these illustrations that he uses in Scripture. And so I just wanted to talk about this as this kind of kicks us off into next week and in the next couple of weeks as we talk about this idea of what it means to be fishers of men. And so principles for fishers of men from fishing, right? And this is going to be great. You guys, this is where I should really switch the mic and Don Hatcher should come up and tell you guys how to fish. But no, this is a thing. 3 things that are principles of fishing that carry over to being a fisher of men. The first one is intentionality and persistence. Intentionality and persistence. In Genesis, God gave mankind dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything that creeps on the ground. Very specific language to say we as humans are supposed to be in charge of creation, the animal life. But here's the funny thing, right? I have a dog, and I can't get it to listen. And that's like a domesticated animal, right? Not to mention, so like the few times that I've been fishing, the fish we do not have an agreement, right? They don't listen to me. We miss each other in communication all the time. And so, like, the funny thing is, right, in chapter 3, we know why that is, right? So we are put in dominion over creation, and then in chapter 3, sin enters into the world, and our dominion over creation is permanently shifted, right? It says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you." So if you wonder why there's weeds in your yard, right? If you wonder why you can't keep things house plants alive, right? If you wonder why there's disease and famine in the world, it all comes from sin. The world doesn't work the way it's supposed to work anymore. But this is the thing. Everything. So when Jesus applies the illustration of fishing to Peter's new vocation as a disciple maker, right? As a inviter of people to follow Jesus, he, I think, is somewhat communicating that, hey, Pete, you know how it's real hard to get fish in your boat? you know how you never caught a fish without getting in your boat and going out and putting in the work and the hours to do that? You know how when you go out and you fish all night and you catch nothing and you come back in and you have to turn around and go do it again the next night? He says, I think some of what he's saying when he says fishers of men is it's not unlike fishing, right? Calling, communicating, inviting the people around you to see Jesus, to meet Jesus, to follow Jesus is going to take intentionality. The same way you've probably never caught a fish accidentally, you've probably never going to catch a person accidentally. People don't just accidentally fall into Jesus, right? Jesus seeks them out either by supernatural means or by somebody he sent into their life, right? With that calling and with an obedient heart. To speak the words of truth about who Jesus is, to actually live out like a kind of person who is already following Jesus, to be intentional, to be persistent. We know that the lives of the apostles were far from easy, right? Their lives were marked by persecution, by famine, by slow progress. And in many ways, I think God had been preparing Peter for his job as an apostle in a fishing boat. He had been showing him this is what it looks like. He was preparing him the same way he prepared David in the field as a shepherd to be king. He prepared Peter for his work in a fishing boat. Pete knew that fishing wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle choice. It meant there was a lot of things Peter didn't get to do, other people got to do, but because of his vocation, he had these rules. He had these boundaries in his life. And when Jesus called Peter, he used that familiar language of his first vocation. He was teaching Peter that just like in his last job, being a disciple of Jesus, making disciples who make disciples was going to take intentionality, and it was going to take persistence. The second thing that we need to know is this. We need to know people. Principles for fishers of men. We need to know people. As a fisherman, Peter would have known, was a man who knew fish. He knew where fish were likely to be, at what times of day. He knew about the seasons where fish were going to be spawning. He knew how to maximize his catch because his bottom line depended on it, right? And this is part of what it means for us to become fishers of men. As we make disciples, inviting people around us to meet and follow Jesus, we learn how to connect with people. We learn effective disciple making requires that we actually care about people the way Jesus cared about Peter, the way Jesus cared about everybody that he interacted with. To know their struggles, to know their needs, to meet them where they're at. I want you to think back to the person who discipled you, who brought you into a relationship with Jesus. Most of us follow a person before we follow Jesus. We see them, we see Jesus through them. We don't even know what we're looking at yet. But we see a way of life. We see a way of treating people. We see a way of speaking we've never seen before, and we're curious, what is the deal with that? And that person, if they're faithful, they say, it's not that I'm different. It's that I've had this interaction with Jesus, and he's changed me. Jesus didn't stand far off from people and expect they figured it out. He got up close in person. He understood who they were. He cared for their needs, expecting nothing in return. I probably quote from this passage more than any other passage in sermons, but it's Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. We're not effective fishers of men if we don't understand that the people we're trying to reach are more important than ourselves. If we don't put them ahead of our own wants, desires, needs, aspirations. And I believe one of the, what's worth noting and meditating on is that before Jesus even gave Peter, even signed him on as a disciple, he was already drawing towards him to minister to others. He was saying, he employed him and said, hey, can I use your boat? And then he says, hey, I need you to come with me so that I can make you a fisher of men. Just like fish, right? People are messy. There's very little convenience or comfort when it comes to caring for people, right? That requires us put ourselves second. And yet there is a reward, right? The reward is the closeness that we get with Jesus. Because guess where Jesus is? Serving others, right? Caring for others. Taking care of people who he knows he's not going to get anything back from. So as a church people, we often wish, right? We often wish that there was more people at the church, or we think, man, we would love to see this place packed full of people. But if we're honest, we have to see ourselves as a part of that. And rather than accepting Jesus' assignment to care for widows and orphans, to really get to know hurting people around us, we shift the blame to all kinds of other things as to why things are the way they are. But the truth is, being fishers of men takes hard work, and it takes knowing people. And I think sometimes we just don't want to do it. And that makes sense, because if we remember, Peter didn't want to fish either. Peter was done fishing. He says, this thing stinks. It's hard work. But he promises to be with us, right? The last thing is this. I'll say before we go is that as fishers fishers of men, we work together. In a few weeks, we're going to do a whole sermon on this, so I'm going to make this really brief and then close and pray. But when we think about that word, and when I think of that, I've heard that story, I don't know about you, since I was a little boy in like Sunday school, right? Jesus says to Peter, I'm going to make you fishers of men, and there's like the little flannel graph, right? And in my brain, just like growing up in central Pennsylvania, having an uncle that liked to trout fish, right? Coming and moving down here, and like this is bass fisher heaven down here, right? Fishing involves standing on the bank of some body of water or on Terry Bing's boat out in the Kissimmee River, and you take a pole with a line on it, and you put it out in the water, and you wait. You wait for the fish to grab the thing, and you pull it in, and then it tries to bite you, and you take a picture for Facebook, and you throw it back in, right? And that's fishing, right? It's recreational, it's individual, and that couldn't be more different than the way Peter thought about fishing. It wasn't recreational, it was business. It was a highly lucrative business. It was taxed, it was regulated, it was industry. That's what it was. It wasn't recreation. And second of all, you couldn't do it by yourself if you tried. Remember, he goes out with his buddy, and there's two of them in the boat with Jesus when they pull in that catch, and then he says, hey, we need your help. We need more help over here. We got such a big full net. And so it's this group activity in his world. And it's the same with being a fisher of men. It's the same with inviting our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus. It's the same with making disciples. You are called as an individual follower of Jesus, but you are called into a team. You were called into a family. And so we can't be effective at inviting our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus if we all just go and do it by ourselves. It's going to require the church to have the attitude of a team. We often think about this whole idea as a one-on-one thing, but the truth is, think about it. The Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He gave that command to a group, to the 12, well, the 11 at that point, but to 11 guys. And there was never this idea of, we'll just divide up the territory and you go that way and I go this way. No, they stayed together. They worked together. Community and mission have always been married concepts. And so this is the thing we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Ms. Dawn, you have to fix it for me. Can you put me on my key principle slide? That this idea that every one of us as followers of Jesus has a new life assignment. And it's, by the way, not that we all quit our jobs tomorrow, right? We don't all have to sell the boat like Peter did. But that in whatever he has you doing already, right, he has an assignment for you in that, for you to make disciples who make disciples.